We live in an era of video game history where fully orchestrated, theatrical, and just straight up good soundtracks are pretty much the norm. Very rarely do we see modern video game companies release games with outright bad soundtracks without getting some kind of heat for it, or, just releasing a day one patch that fixes the soundtrack because of course the version it released didn't have it. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl for the Nintendo Switch, but if we go back, this wasn't always really the case. Sound was always kind of viewed as secondary to the gameplay experience, something that would help it for sure, but not something that was necessary. This is why classic games like Pong didn't have soundtracks at all, and for years afterwards, songs usually only consisted of short jingles to represent the start of a game over, just the start of a new level. This all began to change with the advent of the Nintendo Entertainment System, where slowly but surely, using the NES's limited sound capabilities, full soundtracks would become the standard for most games. Games like Super Mario Bros., Mega Man, and The Legend of Zelda would be some of the most beloved soundtracks for generations to come. And although these games were the era's equivalent of modern AAA titles, that didn't mean there weren't smaller development teams capable of making stellar soundtracks. Silver Surfer, for example, was a game with a very small team and wasn't very good, to be honest, but it had a stellar soundtrack that would endure for generations, just the same as, things like Mario would. The year is 1992. The Nintendo Entertainment System's successor is released, and the era of non-existent soundtracks seems like a distant memory. People are pushing hardware to the limits in order to make memorable soundtracks, and in this very year, Rocky and Bullwinkle for the NES is released. So how does it sound? It sucks. For years, I've been grappling with the knowledge that this game's god-awful soundtrack exists, and for about a month now, I've been trying to figure out how the hell a person who could have gone to have a somewhat successful career in the industry could have had the role of composer on a game with the literal worst music I've ever heard in a video game, or anything else! NES shovelware was plentiful, and bad games were being released all the time, but in none of them have I heard a soundtrack as bad as this one. So, I took it upon myself to fix that. Now, obviously, I'm not working with the same kinds of restraints that the composer at the time had. Like, games back then had to have their own soundtracks programmed into the games. You couldn't just add an MP3 file or something. You couldn't add an MIDI or anything. We'll get to that one, though. So, since I had no programming experience, I couldn't do that if I tried. That said, I could give myself the same technical restraints of the NES sound trip by using a software called FamiTracker. NES music consists of 4 channels that all play the single notes at a time. 2 square channels, a triangle channel, and the noise channel. The noise channel is used mostly for percussion or sound effects because it kind of sounds like TV static, and square and triangle waves are best showcased by just hearing them. You can't play chords at all, which means the best tools you have at your disposal are arpeggios and just simple melodies. My second restraint is quite simple. I have to complete this all in one day. Because it was really short, I managed to do it in one sitting on stream, only to discover that Twitch doesn't automatically save VODs, so that footage is gone. You're just gonna have to believe me that I got this done in 3.5 hours. And, I think it's pretty fitting, because as far as I can tell, the NES game was secondary to the SNES and Game Boy ports, so, clearly there was some time restraints being done, and I think a day is a reasonable time. But, one sitting is better, isn't it? This level and the title screen are actually the same song. It's a song that just uses the theme song from the show Rocky and Bullwinkle, and this song is terrible. Both the TV and the game versions, they're just both unlistenable. There's a reason the show's intro literally talks over itself.
A lot of fun! Come on and join us!
Sure! There's always room for one more!
But given that this is what I would have had to work with if I were composing a game about the show, the theme song is just what I have to use, so I didn't really change anything about the melody whatsoever. For the second square channel, I did a slight arpeggio to represent what I consider to be a guitar sound, but really, when I hear the song in NES form, I instantly think like a banjo or something. Because the loop is so painfully short, I decided to add a counterpart to it, and I stole the leitmotif from the SNES game, because they used the same melody in every song, and because they were basically worked on at the same studio at the same time, I was like, yeah, I can just lift their idea and put it into my own song, and it worked as a really nice counter melody. I adjusted it a little bit so that it would sound a little similar to Buddy Holly by Weezer, because of course I did, and then finally I took the ending theme from the game, and then made that the intro. When I was streaming this, I was losing my mind at how this level looked so intense, with this nefarious looking fella with a bomb, and then Rocky flying around in what looks like a space city, and I'm like, oh my god, this calls for some video game metal. But when I was hearing the song in the game, it was like a baby's lullaby, and I was panicking, like, how on earth did the composer get such annoying sounding lullabies from a very image of evil hurtling explosives at a moose? Anyways, the very first thing I thought of was like a palm muting guitar riff. I used Metallica's Motor Breath as my inspiration. And from there, I just made a bass line that I thought would match it by fiddling around with the keyboard until something sounded good. And then I did the exact same thing for the melody. Not much thought was put into either. I just kind of played around with both until they sounded good. And then I took what I had of the melody and harnessed my inner Mega Man 2 to come up with some counter melody parts. The standout for this song was definitely the solo, which I just thought, okay, scale upwards, then do a Black Sabbath type harmony bend thing, followed by a Dragon Force type, lots of notes crammed into one spots kind of thing. It ended up working pretty well in my opinion. Turns out that this level theme is also reused for the end of level 4 in a rather dilapidated looking town, where you're being chased by the same nefarious fellow that has spiky red bombs throughout the town, and they're all ready to kill you. Then you're hopping on rocks over a river while ice blue mountains and the worst looking clouds in a video game lurk in the background, followed by a forest that clips into existence once the solid blue background ends. It ended up, accidentally, being rather fitting. This level goes from a train to a desert and then the inside of a saloon or something. I genuinely feel bad for the composer here, because there's like 3 entirely different musical themes, but of course I see one thing in common between all 3. The Wild West. In retrospect, when I was composing this at first, I saw the desert and immediately thought Egypt, and then based my song off of that and nothing else. Thankfully I did end up adding the most Wild West thing imaginable, wind. I was thinking how New Super Mario Bros. Handled desert themes, and how they always had lots of wind, so instead of percussion, I dedicated the noise channel to having rhythmic wind sounds. The bass line was supposed to sound mysterious and threatening in a way, so I went with the chord progression of... I do not know music theory, I can't explain this very well, but what I had in mind was half-step intervals are kind of dissonant, so I'll do a dissonant sounding thing and then raise it up and down by a half-step. Please don't kill me, music theory knowers. After trying and failing for 20 minutes on how to come up with a melody that will work with this disgusting bass line, I finally stumbled across, and then I made my first melody just a harmony of that. So with that, I was done somehow with what I consider to be the worst song in the game. My source of inspiration was dissonance equals desert, so... Oh yeah, now that I think about it, what was the composer's idea of desert? I guess this is somewhat Western. It kinda seems like the music that would play if you're drunk out of your mind in a Western bar crying about your ex-wife. I've never heard a song like this in my life, and I don't know how to feel about it aside from depressed. Level 4 takes place on a boat, and then inside a boat, which means it's the first level with a consistent theme that I can take musical ideas from. Or so I thought, until I realized I don't know how to make chiptune sea shanties without straight up taking a traditional sea shanty and putting it in the NES sound font. So I decided to take inspiration from the song itself, which is this kind of stilted and jagged version of the most dissonant jazz I'd ever heard, so... It's like if a jazz song was played by a bunch of drunk rednecks who have never heard the genre before in their life, and all they knew was that it's supposed to swing somewhat. So I've never heard anything like it. So I took a look at the beginning of the level with its pretty, bright blue sky, and took the general idea of jazz from the song originally, and then just ran with it. I threw the boat out of the window, but I guess it kind of works because there's usually like a swing band that plays on cruise ships and stuff, but all I did was make the most generic bass line I could find, that being from Glenn Miller's In the Mood. And then I did my very best at a potential trumpet part. So all I did was just add a counter melody that sounded good in my eyes and decided to move on. This was a soundtrack speed run after all. Level 5 is the very last song in the game, so regardless of the theming, I knew it was going to have to be intense. And indeed, the final level is moderately intense. It takes place in this very orange-looking house with bombs raining from the sky, followed by a dark cave with skull boxes and bats and lava, which of course leads to a direct entrance into a medieval castle that also goes back to a greenhouse, which is also raining bombs, and thousands of posters of Bullwinkle, and honestly, this game is just completely off the wall when it comes to theming. The composer probably only released the soundtrack he did because the levels he was trying to make music for were designed with the philosophy of just put everything in there, we don't care! So what did the original even sound like? This just horrifying circus music, which is how I describe most of the soundtrack, but it also sounds like an ice cream truck. What I decided to do with my final level theme was embrace my inner Mega Man and Doom soundtracks. The main melody is once again accidentally stolen by Metallica, this time Disposable Heroes. The first part of my production process was to make an intense sounding bass part. This time I used the triangle channel and then I made the melody. The solo section was just what seemed appropriate for the part, then, as the climax of the song, I made a harmony for that, which made Family Tracker look like I just put as many notes as possible, and then it looped back again. Technically included on the soundtrack are 2 jingles. The first one is the THQ logo, which sounds just as bad as the rest of the soundtrack. And then the ending jingle, because they couldn't be bothered to do more than a still image ending screen with a 6-second song. For the sake of being thorough, I made my own logo to represent me if I was THQ. I decided to make the main melody a voice memo that I had on my phone for 4 years because I couldn't figure out what song it was from. For the ending theme, I took a note out of the original game, which was to use a level theme as a victory theme. I decided to pick what I thought was the best on the soundtrack, level 2, and make it sound like a game clear theme. And that's it. A 6-second jingle is how the original game ended. There was no credits, which means the composer I've been talking about this whole time is just completely uncredited. The main reason I opened the video the way I did is because I fully expected to find that, similar to very early games, the programmers were left to make the soundtrack themselves. For the early years of video game history, soundtracks were an afterthought as gameplay would come first, and they were typically done by whatever programming and graphics staff they had left, which is why early soundtracks were so limited. I expected, due to how bad the soundtrack was, that it was a similar case here. But it wasn't. Paul Wilkinson was brought on as the composer for this game. He'd previously worked on the Terminator for the NES, which... But for this game, he'd supposedly begun working on his own program that would convert MIDI instruments to the NES sound font, because of course he's a genuinely good programmer who stuck to the task of composing music when clearly it isn't his strong point. But what ended up being the case is that this dude used this game to learn his own program, and that really put it to the test. And in the end, isn't trying something you're unfamiliar with and making a bad first impression normal for every artist? The first thing you make is never going to be your best, unless you're Weezer, of course, but in the end, you'll never get anywhere if you don't start. This project wasn't the best. Each song was borderline plagiaristic in how I lifted ideas from other songs. I relied heavily on what the soundtrack already sounded like, Level 3 was just not a good song, and my instrumentation could have been better. But these things are all things that I can work and improve on. After all, I did this in just 3.5 hours, and I'd never really used FamiTracker before, so this is my starting point.
And although it's a certainty that I'm never gonna get a faster 100% soundtrack speed run, it's only uphill from here. Thanks for watching.